27 minutes past 7 p.m. Central African Time. Good evening and welcome back. You are tuned into Salah Media. This is the Special Focus. My name is Zahid, Jadwat, and we are together right up until 8 p.m. Of course, many of us are anticipating the presidential address, which comes up at 8 p.m. shortly after the show. So many of us are waiting for that. But before we get to that, we are discussing violent protests in South Africa. That is something which is really hogging the headlines this week, starting off from Monday, where parents and the community members of the Brackenfell community clashed with the EFF members outside Brackenfell High School. This, of course, after allegations of alleged racism surfaced at the school. But this is part of a broader problem of violent protests which have been taking place across South Africa over the last few years, and undoubtedly it seems as though these have been on the rise. These protests seem to have turned violent as South Africans become increasingly frustrated with poverty, crime, corruption, service delivery, and many other issues that have plagued the post-apartheid South Africa. So we are now joined for an exclusive interview by Professor Adam Habib, who is the Vice Chancellor of the Witwatersrand University. Assalamu alaikum, Professor. Good evening and welcome to the show.
Wa alaikum salam, and thank you for having me.
Indeed, it is a pleasure to have you on the show this evening. So, before I get to your thoughts on the recent events that have unfolded in Brackenfell, of course, that's something I really do want to discuss with you a bit later on in the discussion. But to put this discussion into context, why is the right to protest so important in a democracy? What role does it have to play within the framework of democracy?
Well, it seems to me that democracy is that the actual choosing of leaders happens once every 4 or 5 years, depending on whichever system you're under. And so, in a sense, the big question is, how do ordinary citizens influence the choices of decision making in between those elections? And if institutional processes are not working, if writing or deputations or engaging local political elites is not having an impact, then it seems to me that protests are necessary to bring your concerns to the attention of the political elites, of the government officials, even of the CEOs of private companies, etc. And so it's an established norm that democracies allow for protests and they allow for what we call social mobilization. But democracies do not do so in an unqualified way. They say that social mobilization and protests are important, but they must be conducted in a peaceful manner. They must be respectful of other citizens' rights and interests. And there is, if you like, a parameter within which that protest is allowed, and that's true of many other parts of the world. It's true for the South African Constitution. Often, social activists speak about the right of protest, but they seem to forget that our Constitution is very clear about the parameters within which that right is exercised, and it asks you to do so in particular ways. And too often, social activists think that they take on the right of protest, but they never take on the responsibility of protest, both of which are defined in our Constitution.
Mm-hmm. And, I also want to hear from the listeners as well. What are your thoughts on this? Of course, you can send us your messages on WhatsApp via the number 061 766 0355. Alternatively, you can leave your comment below the live videos on our YouTube and Facebook channels. Professor Adam Habib is my guest this evening. And of course, he believes that the reason for protests is how when how do citizens influence choices between formal elections, which are guaranteed to us by democracy? Of course, we have elections every 5 years in South Africa. So the reason now is, how do citizens now influence these choices between the formal elections that take place? And when institutes don't work in a way, then protesting becomes the next option. And of course, it is a right that is guaranteed to us by the Constitution. It is widely accepted and understood that there is a right to peaceful protest. But I think, Professor Habib, it becomes worrying and troublesome when violence erupts. So why does violence tend to occur, especially in South Africa, where nearly 80% of protests in the year 2014 had an element of violence?
Yeah. So I think that there is a couple of reasons. So let me start looking at the more generic reasons. Research of protests around the world by senior scholars of social movements and protests suggests that there are two reasons why protests become violent. The first is when the conduct of the police. And if police are particularly violent, if they are particularly aggressive, if they unduly attack protesters and arrest them, then they can impact on that protest and turn it violent. And that's often, if you like, one of the reasons why protest leaders say and explain why protests become violent. There is a second reason that is articulated, and that second reason is when the protest community factionalizes. So when political parties try to control that social movement or that social protest, and they try to control it by outbidding each other because they want to use that protest for their own political ends. When that happens, protests also run the risk of becoming violent. And in a sense, both those rationales play out globally, and clearly they play out in South Africa. In South Africa, I have argued increasingly that protests become violent, in part because of the policing. Our police are not sufficiently well trained to demobilize protests without violence. But it is also true that in many cases, they become violent because it factionalizes. The ANC or the EFF are trying to control the protest, and that protest becomes violent. I'm also saying that South Africans treat and don't hold people who are violent to account. So too often, if you burn a building or you burn schools or you burn public facilities, then nobody pays the consequences. And when nobody pays the consequences, you don't create a culture of accountability. So I've said before, if you looked at the Click saga recently, or if you looked at what happened in Seneca, in both those cases, there was the thrashing of first the town and Click store. How many people were arrested? How many people went to jail? What were the consequences for the leaders? None of that played out. And I can give you example after example, including when the fees must fall $1.5 billion worth of infrastructure was burnt. How many of those students were arrested? The ones that were arrested effectively were those that burnt a police vehicle. Nobody was arrested for the burnings of buildings. And so, in a sense, as a society, we tolerate a lot of violence. Now, all of us complain about the violence against women and sexual violence. You can't say I'm against sexual violence and violence against women and then tolerate violence when it's your political party. That's unacceptable, because what you're doing is consolidating a culture of violence. And too many progressive leaders, leaders from trade unions, leaders from social struggles, and politicians speak with forked tongue. They say one thing and they do another. And I think that we as South Africans need to hold them accountable.
Mhm. And you mentioned these two particular reasons why protests seem to turn violent in some cases, and fair enough, those could be in their place. But do you think the general culture of violence that is prevalent, unfortunately, whether we like it or not, we have to admit that there is a culture of violence that is prevalent across South Africa at the moment, and of course, it is each person's individual responsibility, actually a collective responsibility to combat this. But do you think the culture of violence that is prevalent in our society at present actually contributes to this?
Yeah, so absolutely it does. So I would argue that a culture of violence emerges in two contexts. One is the structural context, when you have a society with deep level inequalities and deep level political and social polarization, then that society has a level of violence in it. So forget South Africa. If you look at why is the United States far more violent than Germany, part of it has got to do with the very, very deep inequalities in American society and the very, very deep social and political polarization in the society. So that clearly is a manifest and is evident in South Africa, and we have that. We have a history of violence. We have a history of violence by the apartheid state, and we have a history of violence against the apartheid state, and that has tended to create a culture where we glorify violence. So listen to how many young people kind of think it's so cool to be violent, or so cool to attack the police, or so cool to burn things. Look at the kinds of songs we sing and how we sing it, as if these are some things that we should be celebrating as contemporary activities, as opposed to those activities that were necessary under an apartheid system. So I think that that's there. But I also think that there's a lot of justification of violence. You would be amazed at how many young people say, well, we are violent because there is structural violence, as if the presence of economic exploitation justifies uh, the violence of individual actors. And by the way, that's amongst young people. I've met lots of young people who glorify violence, including young Muslim activists who've done so. And we often don't call them out. And I think they must be called out, because they sit in kind of middle class households, and then they can pretend that violence is kind of cool and adventurous. There are consequences for those violence. People die, people go to
Mm.
jail, and I think we must hold people accountable for that.
Yeah, and I see a few comments coming in from some of the viewers on Facebook here. We will get to those comments in a short while, and for the rest of the listeners as well, remember that you can engage with us and you can engage with Professor Adam Habib this evening. We are speaking about violent protests in South Africa. Professor, earlier on you mentioned that South Africans don't generally hold violent protesters to account. And you also mentioned a little bit earlier than that, you mentioned that those who perpetrate these violent protests, these acts of violence during protests, are not really willing to take responsibility for that. Why is it that they are not willing to take responsibility?
Well, partly because they don't get held accountable, right? Firstly, they're not willing to take accountability because they see other leaders getting away with it and doing it and getting away with it. So think about this. There are members of parliament. There are members of parliament today who glorify violence, who've engaged in it, who enable it, and who defend it. We know that some of them are associated with the EFF, but we also know that many others are associated with the ANC, and they get rewarded for it. And so when other people do it, why should we be surprised? There are political leaders that allowed it. What happened to the people that called for violence or called for protest? People use the word protest, but they know it's going to be violent. When political leaders in parliament say attack, what does that mean? It's glorifying violence. they're not held accountable. And that's across the political divide. So I think that's why we don't, that's the first thing that is a problem. The second is nobody pays for the consequences of doing it. I give you examples. $1.5 billion worth of infrastructure in South African universities were burnt. Nobody was held accountable. Schools were burnt in many townships around protests. Nobody was held accountable. That's unacceptable. And then third is the incompetence of the state. Many people in the state are not adequately trained. So how many times have cases gone to court and got thrown out because the prosecutors don't know what they're doing? They can't fight the case. They don't have the appropriate skill sets. And yet they got appointed to senior positions in the police service. Look at the corruption that's playing out in the police services or in government structures. And then you ask yourself, why is there a lack of accountability? Because senior people in our state, in our police service, get away with it, and there are no consequences for that.
But how do violent protests actually undermine democracy? And, to a certain extent, possibly erode the legitimacy of the actual right to actually protest?
So here's the thing. Let me give you an example. If you allow violence, you allow for some people to be silenced. So let me give you an example. If you're having a protest and there are people, let's say in a university, and there's a small group of people who want to protest and shut down the university, and other students want to continue their studies, and the small group of protesters go and threaten them and assault them and threaten to burn the buildings. What you've effectively done is those people don't have any trust that the police are protecting them. They don't have any trust that they can speak openly. They don't have, they are fearful. And what you create in that context is the people, the rule of the person with the most force. The people who will prevail are those that have the most force. And ironically, that means rich people get away with it. Because what do rich people do? Well, rich people can hire security. They can hire people to guard them. They can go to private services. Poor people can't do that. And they are the vulnerable victims of a structure, a system where force prevails. And that's the problem in South Africa. The rich today, in however violent our society is, the rich live behind high walls. They've got private security. They buy their security because they can afford to buy their security. The people who suffer are the poor in townships, in suburbs, who can't afford to buy security. They don't have the luxury. And they are the real victims of this violence in our society. So all of these people who are violent claim they're doing it for radical economic transformation, for revolution, for free education. They create an environment where the poor and the marginalized are left vulnerable because of their selfishness. And it seems to me that we need to be frank about it and openly call it.
Yeah, and interestingly, I see a comment here from Shabnam Pulesa Mohammed, who says, have universities held private security companies responsible and accountable for violence against students? And on a similar note, there's a comment here, particularly from a viewer by the name of Julian Schutt, who says, this man is conservative and totally out of touch with the reality of the oppressed, and he has been named an oppressor himself by many. And the question from this viewer here is, do you think that violence against the students, in which many were severely injured and maimed, some having to undergo surgery, is justified? This is a question from Julian Schutt.
Okay, so let me start with Gillian on the labeling. Before Gillian was even born, I was fighting this struggle. I was in prison. So it's very nice for Gillian, who's a post-Apartheid revolutionary, to talk about struggle and revolution and radical, because it's easy to do so. But Gillian has never had to build. She's never had to make hard decisions. She's never had to be in an apartheid prison. She hasn't been tortured. So she can speak easily about what it means to be a revolution. And frankly, I find it outrageous that these kind of peacetime revolutionaries shoot them out and try to label. They are the architects of a toxic political discourse in our society. They're intolerant and they threaten people who don't agree with them. And frankly, I don't make apologies for calling them out and frankly challenging them. They are no different to the fascists in the EFF or the Stalinists that have attacked people elsewhere. So frankly, you can label me. My credibility was established long before, and I don't need affirmation from people like Jillian. So I want to be frank about it. Second, at a place like Wits, where we did bring in the police, there were 17 attempts to burn. There were 17 attempts to burn buildings. I negotiated with those students for 10 days. And then I went to a poll where the students were asked to decide, would you like to complete the academic year? 78% of those students said, we would like to complete the academic year. Please make us complete the academic year. Those student leaders who claimed they spoke for those students, asked them to explain why 78% of them were this thing. Those student leaders had lost the support of their own students. Most of those kids, the reason WITS is what it is and it's as strong as it is, the reason we have the credibility of the degree, the reason we are financially sustainable, the reason we haven't lost our academics, the reason we haven't fallen apart like ESCOM and Transnet is because we made hard decisions and held accountable those people. You think I did something illegal? Take me to court. Let's see how far you go. We've been challenged in court time and time again. So don't give me the story of these pseudo-revolutionaries. Because my job as a vice chancellor is to make sure that teaching happens, that research happens, that people pass and they go on to become doctors and lawyers. WITS does that every single year. We do that because we've created a place of learning. It's one of the few institutions, public institutions in this country that works. So frankly, I don't care what pseudo-revolutionaries they say. What I want to know is, do I find it tragic that I had to call police in? Absolutely, I do. I find it tragic. And I ask myself, why did I have to be in a position to have done that? But let me be blunt. If anybody tries to burn Wits University, if anybody tries to assault my staff or my students, I will hold them accountable. Because we've seen politicians like Jacob Zuma and Ace Magashule and Julius Malema say one thing. They try and threaten our public institutions and destroy our environment. I am not prepared to allow this. And I don't get judged by whether politicians like me or political activists like me. I get judged by how many graduates I produce, how much research I produce. Is that financially sustainable? Have I transformed the place? And WITS has used to graduate 6.5, it now graduates 9.5. It used to produce 1,300 publications, it now produces 2,000. It used to be a primarily white institution, it's now a primarily black institution. It's financially sustainable. That's why people come to WITS. Not because of people like Jillian, not because of people who break the place. We keep that place safe. And so people who want to call me labels, that's okay. I've been called labels by the apartheid state. I've been deported from the American by the Bush regime. Why do I care if somebody else with a malevolent political agenda joined the queue after the apartheid state, after the Bush regime? I don't really care. I'm not here to please you. I'm here to make sure that I do the job I was mandated by the nation. And I would like more people to do that. So I'm sorry to be frank, but I'm way past pandering to what is really nonsensical rhetorical gestures by people who've never built anything.
All right. Julian, I do hope that if you are still tuned in, I do hope that this response does satisfy your question. And of course, I would like to go deeper into this discussion, but that isn't the main focus of this discussion this evening, and we are fast running out of time. Professor, in an article which was published by The Conversation, you wrote that social mobilization requires rage, but not violence. So tell us more about the distinction between rage versus violence.
So there's an interesting debate, and actually it's a powerful debate by Martin Luther King Jr., actually. And Martin Luther King makes the argument that rage, anger, if you like, is important because it is anger that mobilizes people's passions. It's anger, it's when you're angry about the social injustices of our world that you get impassioned to address that challenge and take to it and address it and try and build social justice. But it doesn't have to be violent, because when it turns violent, it undermines the cause. So when you start becoming violent, you lose people's support. You lose support for the social cause itself. And this was Martin Luther King making the argument with Stokely Carmichael in the United States in the civil rights movement. Similar arguments have been held in other struggles around the world, in social struggles in many, many parts of the world. And so that's where the argument comes in. So, this is the point for me and in the article. You can try and want to be violent, but the research shows that when you are violent, you undermine support for your own cause. Let me give you one simple example in South Africa. In Fees Must Fall in 2015, that protest was relatively peaceful. Relatively peaceful. In 2016, it was far more violent. In 2015, it was a great success. There was a great, they won their demand in 2015. It also had huge support. Tens of thousands of people marched on Parliament across race and class and on the union buildings and in Luthuli House. That didn't happen in 2016. They lost significant amounts of support. That's why 80% of students, 78%, voted against the continuation of that protest. And the reason was people became violent. They became crudely racist. And we tolerated that. And we allow that. And if you want to know the consequences of crude racism, go to India and see what plays out under Modi government. Go to Brazil and see what plays out under Bolsonaro. Go to America and see what plays out under Trump. And it seems to me that loses people's support. And that's why 2016 was far more violent. So the research shows that actually it's tactically correct to want to mobilize, be angry, but conduct it in a peaceful way. This is not apartheid South Africa. For all of our flaws as a society, it is a democracy. You can't take the strategies of the 1960s and 70s in deep apartheid South Africa, in a deeply colonial society, and apply it in a democratic society.
All right. And I do wish we had more time to unpack this discussion further, but unfortunately, we are running out of time. There are just 2 minutes left for 8 p.m. And of course, we are anticipating the presidential address at 8 p.m. So we are going to have to wrap up here. But thank you so much for your time, Professor Habib.
Thank you for having me.
And thank you to the listeners as well for tuning in, and for those of you who contributed to this discussion through your comments, by sending us your comments. Of course, it's really interesting, and it makes the discussion more interesting when you do send us your comments. And of course, you don't really have to agree with the guest all the time, but yes, you do have your right to air your views as well, because this is everyone's platform, and this is what we do here at Salam Media, humanitarian journalism. You do have the right to share your views, and we do look forward to it when you share your views with us on the show and off the show as well. We are looking forward to your comments to continue after the show as well, off air. But that's where we are going to have to leave it for this evening. From myself, Zahid, Jadwat, and the team, thank you so much for tuning in. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.